a man utterly despised by his own royal bloodline, yet granted the profound glory of a state funeral. Why is this paradox happening? This is Edward VIII, the gay millionaire scandal the Windsors tried to hide. How did an all-powerful sovereign willingly reduce himself to the subservient lapdog of an eccentric billionaire? The sheer magnitude of this royal collapse reveals itself only when the heavy layers of romanticized propaganda, meticulously constructed and ruthlessly protected by the British establishment over several decades, are violently stripped away from the public consciousness. The official narrative, fed to generations, insists that in December 1936, King Edward VIII committed the ultimate act of chivalry by abdicating his throne because he simply could not bear the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American woman. The world wept, captivated by a love so profound it fractured an empire. But as the frantic urgency of the 1930s faded into the cynical, opulent decades of the post-war era, the grand fairy tale began to rot from the inside out. By the time the 1950s dawned, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were living a hollow nomadic existence. Exiled from Britain, stripped of his Royal Highness title for his wife, and devoid of any genuine political or moral purpose, Edward had withered. He was no longer the dynamic Golden Prince of Wales who had once captivated millions. Instead, he had degenerated into a frail, needy, and terribly insecure older man whose entire universe was terrifyingly dependent on a woman who was growing increasingly suffocated by his obsessive devotion. Wallis Simpson, the woman who had inadvertently toppled a dynasty, found herself trapped in a gilded cage with an emasculated ghost. She was intensely bored, endlessly hungry for the adulation, wealth, and vibrant excitement that her husband's diminished status could no longer provide. The greatest romance of the century had calcified into a suffocating tomb of resentment, laying the perfect, vulnerable groundwork for a predator to enter. Enter Jimmy Donahue, a man who represented everything the rigid, duty-bound British monarchy despised. Unburdened by noble titles, rigid diplomatic protocol, or the suffocating weight of historical legacy, Donahue possessed a weapon far more dangerous in the decadent, morally bankrupt circles of cafe society. An absolutely limitless, untethered wealth combined with a ruthless, insatiable appetite for social transgression. As the heir to the F.W. Woolworth department store fortune, Jimmy was an American billionaire who operated entirely outside the boundaries of conventional morality. In a fiercely conservative era where homosexuality was largely criminalized and heavily stigmatized, Donahue was spectacularly and aggressively, openly gay. He was a wild, chaotic force of nature who reveled in shattering taboos, frequently hosting outrageous parties, cross-dressing in extravagant evening gowns, and utilizing his massive financial resources to purchase the absolute submission of the elite. Jimmy was the cousin of Barbara Hutton, famously dubbed the poor little rich girl, and like her, he was a product of staggering wealth entirely divorced from consequence. He was a hunter in the social jungle, and when he locked eyes with the increasingly restless Duchess of Windsor and her fading, desperately compliant husband, looking directly past the fading, tragic aura of their exiled royalty, the American billionaire immediately identified the ultimate, most tantalizing prey available in the transatlantic social jungle. The infiltration began with calculated precision, targeting the glaring cracks in the Windsor marriage. Jimmy Donahue offered Wallis Simpson exactly what the Duke could not: boundless youth, an injection of dangerous, thrilling energy, and a seemingly bottomless bank account that could fund her insatiable appetite for Parisian haute couture, lavish jewels, and endless, hedonistic nights out. Despite his well-known sexual orientation, Donahue was a master of seductive manipulation, and he launched a brazen public courtship of the Duchess. To the absolute horror of the conservative aristocratic circles observing them, Wallis responded with enthusiastic fervor. Suddenly, the woman for whom a king had abdicated was seen dancing late into the night at elite nightclubs with a flamboyant, openly gay playboy, leaving her husband sitting alone at the table. The Duchess's blatant, highly visible infidelity was merely the superficial surface of the scandal. The true, horrifying depth lay entirely in the Duke's profoundly shocking, deeply unnatural reaction to her public betrayals. Instead of exhibiting the righteous fury of a betrayed husband or the dignified outrage of a former monarch, Edward VIII leaned into a profound, disturbing state of submission. This is the dark, heavily suppressed core of the Windsor exile, the lavender dynamic that threatened to bring the entire British establishment to its knees. The whispers that tore through the elite salons of Paris and New York suggested a psychological and physical dynamic far more twisted than a simple affair. It became glaringly apparent to those in their inner circle that the Duke of Windsor was trapped in a state of profound cuckoldry, exhibiting a voyeuristic complacence that bordered on the pathological. He not only tolerated his wife's public romantic involvement with another man, he actively facilitated it, hovering on the periphery of their relationship as a willing, subservient spectator. The former sovereign of the British Empire was thoroughly dominated by the wild, unpredictable charisma of Jimmy Donahue. In a grotesque subversion of power, the royal couple happily allowed this erratic American heir to pick up the tab for their luxurious lifestyle, paying for their extravagant dinners, chartered yachts, and endless vacations, effectively purchasing his way into their bed and their lives. The historic narrative of the grand romance mutated into a bizarre bisexual triad, where a deposed king willingly surrendered his masculinity, his pride, and his royal dignity to maintain his proximity to a wife who no longer desired him, entirely funded and controlled by a man who treated them both as exquisite, acquired toys. The intelligence corridors of London did not remain ignorant of this catastrophic humiliation. For the British royal family and the shadowy operatives of M1B5, the situation unfolding across the Atlantic and in Paris was not merely a family embarrassment. It was an unprecedented national security crisis and a direct existential threat to the crown. Queen Elizabeth II, who had ascended to the throne in 1952, and her mother, the fiercely formidable Queen Mother, viewed the Duke's behavior with a mixture of absolute disgust and icy terror. The Queen Mother had always despised Wallis Simpson, blaming the abdication crisis for forcing her husband, the stuttering and reluctant George VI, onto the throne and ultimately into an early grave. Now, receiving highly classified intelligence reports detailing how the former King of England was being publicly cuckolded and financially sustained by an openly gay American socialite, the royal fury was absolute. If the global press were to break the story that the man who once bore the title of defender of the faith had devolved into a pathetic sycophant in a depraved bisexual love triangle, the meticulously crafted sanctity of the monarchy could be irreparably shattered. The greatest love story was the only protective shield the Duke had left. If that illusion fell, it would expose the House of Windsor to unparalleled ridicule and vicious political attacks. Consequently, the British government initiated one of the most ruthless, covert suppression campaigns of the 20th century. The full, terrifying weight of the state intelligence apparatus was brought down upon the situation. MI5 operatives were tasked with closely monitoring the Windsors' movements, intercepting communications and compiling extensive dossiers on Donahue's erratic behavior. High-ranking British diplomats were dispatched with explicitly threatening instructions, cornering the Duke in private and applying brutal political pressure. They made it chillingly clear that his royal allowance, his remaining social standing, and his precarious relationship with his homeland were entirely contingent upon his immediate separation from Donahue. Simultaneously, a draconian blackout was imposed on the British media through the strategic use of D-notices and intense behind-the-scenes intimidation from Fleet Street proprietors aligned with the Crown. A terrifyingly effective wall of silence was erected. Not a single British newspaper dared to print a word about the Duchess's scandalous affair or the Duke's humiliating complicity. The establishment functioned as a singular, ruthless organism, determined to bury the grotesque reality of the former king's decadence beneath a fabricated veneer of respectable, if slightly tragic, exile. Despite the fierce intervention of the British Secret Service, the bizarre and destructive triad continued for 4 agonizing years, fueled by Donahue's money and the Windsors' desperate, parasitic need for distraction. The psychological toll was immense, further eroding the Duke's rapidly decaying sense of self-worth. He was reduced to fetching drinks for his wife's lover, enduring public insults from Donahue, and helplessly watching as the woman he sacrificed in empire for openly preferred the company of a man who ultimately viewed her as a magnificent, temporary amusement. But like all relationships built on the volatile foundations of narcissism, transactional wealth, and emotional manipulation, the triad eventually collapsed under its own toxic weight. By 1954, Jimmy Donahue, possessing the notoriously short attention span of the chronically spoiled, simply grew bored. The novelty of owning a king and a duchess had worn off. The Windsors had become old, needy, and terribly tedious. In a final devastating act of humiliation, the American playboy discarded the royal couple as easily as one might discard a tarnished piece of jewelry. The aftermath was a grim testament to the tragic consequences of their hollow lives. Bereft of Donahue's chaotic energy and financial lifeblood, the Duke and Duchess were forced back into the stifling, miserable reality of their decaying marriage. The fairy tale had been thoroughly gutted, leaving nothing but an empty shell of regret. Jimmy Donahue's own trajectory spiraled downward into darkness. Without the royal playthings to anchor his mania, he descended deeper into severe substance abuse and psychological instability, eventually dying a lonely, pathetic death from an acute drug overdose, his vast wealth unable to save him from his own demons. The Duke of Windsor lived out his final twilight years in an agonizing state of physical and emotional isolation. The man who had once stood at the absolute pinnacle of global power died in Paris in 1972, a fractured, deeply unhappy figure, his grand historic sacrifice forever tainted by the sordid reality of his submission. Wallace outlived him by over a decade, descending into a horrific state of dementia, a silent prisoner in her own decaying mansion, entirely forgotten by the vibrant world she had once so desperately tried to conquer. The story of Edward, Wallace, and Jimmy Donahue stands as a chilling, unvarnished rebuke to the enduring power of historical myth-making. It reveals the terrifying fragility of human dignity when stripped of purpose and exposed to the corrosive elements of unchecked wealth and desperate, unrequited need. The British establishment successfully buried the scandal, preserving the glossy, fictionalized version of the abdication for the history books. But the truth remains a haunting specter. It proves that the most profound royal tragedies are not forged on battlefields or in the noble halls of Parliament, but in the quiet, desperate corners of the human heart, where even a king can willingly trade his crown to become a slave to his own paralyzing weaknesses. Would you like me to elaborate on the specific diplomatic threats made by the British government to force the Duke to end the association? The scene was a jarring inversion of natural power. The man groomed from birth to rule an empire now sat quietly in smoky Parisian nightclubs, entirely overshadowed by an American department store heir who unapologetically flaunted his wealth and his claim on the Duchess. The answer lies in the sheer, unadulterated emptiness of the Windsors' existence following the catastrophic fallout of the abdication. By the time the calendar turned to 1950, the adrenaline of their historic rebellion had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying void. Edward and Wallace were not merely exiled, they were spiritually marooned. They possessed vast wealth and the residual glamour of their infamy, but they lacked the one thing that gives a human life structural integrity: purpose. The British establishment had effectively quarantined them, freezing them out of any meaningful diplomatic or national role. They were condemned to wander aimlessly between the Waldorf Astoria in New York, their lavish mansion in the Bois de Boulogne in Paris, and the sun-drenched, morally bankrupt playgrounds of the French Riviera. They were trapped in a perpetual, exhausting cycle of dinner parties, golf tournaments, and superficial social climbing. Wallace, ever the ambitious socialite, found this endless purgatory agonizing. She had married a king, anticipating a life of unparalleled global influence, only to find herself shackled to a needy, hyper-anxious man who followed her from room to room like a desperate child, constantly requiring validation. Edward's legendary devotion, the very thing that had cost him his empire, had mutated into a suffocating, pathetic clinginess. He had traded his royal duties for the full-time occupation of worshiping his wife, and she was utterly, violently bored of him. It was into this fragile, highly combustible atmosphere of boredom and resentment that Jimmy Donahue inserted himself like a targeted explosive. The introduction did not happen in a grand palace, but rather in the transient, privileged vacuum of a transatlantic luxury liner. When Donahue first approached the Duke and Duchess, he did not utilize the obsequious bowing and scraping that the royal couple had grown so weary of from sycophantic social climbers. Instead, Donahue utilized a weapon far more effective: sheer, unapologetic audacity. He treated the former King of England not as a deity to be revered, but as a quaint, slightly amusing artifact. He mocked the rigid protocols that the Duke still desperately clung to. For Wallace, this brazen disrespect was an intoxicating breath of fresh air. Here was a man who was not intimidated by the heavy, suffocating weight of the Windsor myth. Donahue possessed the legendary, practically infinite Woolworth fortune, meaning he could match and often exceed the royal couple's spending power. He didn't need their status, he simply wanted to play with them. And play he did. Donahue recognized immediately that Wallace was starved for danger. She was a woman in her mid-50s, terrified of fading into the background, terrified of becoming irrelevant. Jimmy offered her an immediate, concentrated injection of youth and rebellion. He dragged the Duchess out of the stuffy conservative drawing rooms of the European aristocracy and plunged her headfirst into the vibrant underground world of the gay elite. He took her to clandestine clubs in New York and Paris, introducing her to a subculture where her royal title was utterly meaningless, but her sharp wit and cynical glamour made her an absolute goddess. Donahue, who was known to frequently cross-dress and adopt extravagant feminine personas during these wild nights, treated Wallace not as a delicate flower, but as a co-conspirator in his relentless assault on high society's moral codes. He showered her with gifts that even the Duke struggled to afford, casually dropping tens of thousands of dollars on custom jewelry and lavish gestures. He made her feel dangerous, desired, and alive in a way her husband had not managed in over a decade. But the true terrifying genius of Donahue's infiltration lay in his psychological dismantling of the Duke of Windsor. A lesser manipulator would have simply discarded the husband, treating him as a nuisance to be avoided. Donahue, however, understood the deeply ingrained submissive psychology of Edward VIII. Edward was a man who throughout his entire life had violently rejected the crushing responsibilities of leadership. He had always sought dominant, forceful women to make decisions for him, to mother him, and to shield him from the consequences of his own actions. When Wallace transferred her dominant energy and attention away from Edward and toward Donahue, the Duke did not assert his masculine authority. He simply transferred his subservience to the newly formed triad. He became desperately eager to please Donahue, terrified that if he alienated the chaotic billionaire, he would lose Wallace completely. The social dynamics of this trio were a grotesque spectacle that left their contemporaries simultaneously fascinated and repulsed. The former King of England was routinely seen performing the duties of a low-level servant for the American playboy. Witnesses recalled agonizing scenes at high-end restaurants where Donahue would deliberately ignore the Duke, speaking exclusively and intimately to Wallace, while Edward sat in absolute silence, a strained, anxious smile plastered across his face, waiting desperately for a crumb of attention. Donahue would routinely pick up the check for massive, extravagant dinners, pulling out thick wads of cash to pay for the royal couple's champagne and caviar, effectively reducing the former monarch to the status of a kept man. The humiliation was not accidental. It was a highly orchestrated performance of power. Donahue delighted in proving to the world and to himself that his money could buy the absolute subjugation of the most famous man on earth. There is a highly documented, devastating anecdote that perfectly encapsulates the depth of this psychological torture. During one of their frequent transatlantic voyages, the Windsors were preparing to board the majestic Queen Elizabeth ocean liner. The Duke, a man whose entire life had been governed by the strict punctuality of naval time and royal scheduling, was pacing the deck in a state of near hysterical panic. But he was not angry about a delay. He was terrified because Jimmy Donahue had not yet arrived. The ship's captain, fully aware of the protocol surrounding a former sovereign, was holding the massive vessel at the dock, delaying thousands of passengers. The Duke of Windsor stood at the rail, literally wringing his hands, pleading with the ship's officers to wait just a few minutes longer for his wife's lover. When Donahue finally strolled up the gangway, spectacularly late and entirely unapologetic, he did not offer an excuse to the pacing king. He simply kissed Wallace, patted Edward patronizingly on the shoulder, and ordered a cocktail. The Duke, rather than exploding in righteous indignation, visibly slumped with profound relief, following the pair to their stateroom like a grateful beaten hound who had just been allowed back inside the house. This public degradation was not a secret confined to the walls of luxury cabins. It was bleeding out into the open, creating a massive, terrifying liability for the British government. The intelligence apparatus, specifically MI5, had been keeping a watchful, paranoid eye on the Duke of Windsor ever since his deeply problematic flirtation with the Nazi high command prior to World War II. They already knew he was a man of tragically poor judgment, but the Donahue affair was a different kind of threat entirely. This rapidly unfolding crisis transcended any conventional political betrayal, mutating instantly into a profound, terrifying moral and institutional catastrophe that threatened to permanently derail the British monarchy. British intelligence operatives were permanently stationed in the lobbies of the Waldorf Astoria and the Ritz in Paris. These hardened men, who had spent the previous decade hunting spies and breaking codes, were now tasked with the deeply uncomfortable job of documenting the bizarre bisexual escapades of the king's uncle. Their confidential reports, wired directly to the highest levels of Whitehall, read like scenes from a decadent, surrealist nightmare. The agents meticulously recorded how Donahue was not merely sleeping with the Duchess, but actively mocking the Duke to his face. They reported on the wild, drug-fueled parties where the boundaries of gender and propriety were entirely obliterated, with the former King of England sitting passively in the corner, nodding along to the music, thoroughly emasculated and entirely dependent on the goodwill of a man who viewed him as a pathetic joke. The intelligence dossiers confirmed what the highest echelons of the British aristocracy had feared most. The myth of the great romantic exile was a complete fabrication. The Duke was not a tragic hero suffering nobly for love. He was a broken, spineless man suffering the extreme indignities of a very modern, very perverse cuckolding. For Queen Elizabeth II, a young monarch desperately trying to solidify the moral authority of the crown in a rapidly changing post-war world, this information was highly toxic. It was a ticking time bomb of public relations that, if detonated by the press, could shatter the illusion of royal superiority forever. The reports landing on the polished mahogany desks of Whitehall were not merely scandalous. They were politically radioactive. For the British establishment still recovering from the brutal economic and psychological toll of the Second World War, the monarchy was the last remaining pillar of global prestige. Queen Elizabeth II was a young sovereign burdened with the impossible task of projecting an image of immaculate moral authority to an empire that was rapidly dismantling itself. The intelligence dossiers arriving from Paris and New York threatened to obliterate that image entirely. M5 operatives stationed in the shadows of the world's most exclusive hotels were transmitting a narrative so grotesque that it defied the comprehension of the conservative men tasked with reading it. They were not tracking a defecting spy or a rogue general. They were meticulously documenting the daily, agonizing emasculation of the man who had once been their supreme commander. The British government quickly realized that they were fighting a war on two fronts. On one side, they had to contain the explosive reality of the bisexual triad from reaching the fiercely loyal, yet easily disillusioned British public. On the other side, they had to somehow manage the deeply unstable, hyper-wealthy American playboy who held the reputation of the royal family in his manicured hands. The strategy they deployed was a masterclass in ruthless, institutional censorship. A formidable wall of silence was constructed around the British Isles. Fleet Street, the beating heart of the British press, was quietly but forcefully brought to heel. Newspaper proprietors, men who relied on the favor of the crown for their knighthoods and social standing, were given explicit, unspoken directives. The D-notice system, typically reserved for matters of acute national security and military secrets, was informally stretched to cover the sexual and financial degradation of the Duke of Windsor, while the American gossip columns and French tabloids gleefully hinted at the scandalous triangle, publishing photographs of Wallace and Jimmy Donahue laughing uproariously, while Edward trailed behind them like a forgotten piece of luggage. The British public was fed a sterile, fabricated diet of respectful exile. The British reader saw only stiff portraits and polite accounts of the Windsors attending charity balls, completely oblivious to the depraved reality unfolding across the channel. But burying the truth in the press did not solve the root of the problem. Jimmy Donahue was entirely immune to British political pressure. He was an American citizen, armed with an inexhaustible supply of Woolworth money, and he possessed a chaotic, destructive personality that thrived on defying authority. High-ranking British diplomats were dispatched to Paris, ordered to corner the Duke in private, and deliver a series of brutal ultimatums. The message was stripped of all royal deference. Rid yourselves of the American, or face the total severing of your financial lifeline. The Duke, despite his vast personal wealth accumulated before the abdication, lived a lifestyle of such extreme, unhinged extravagance that he still heavily relied on an untaxed, under-the-table allowance provided by his brother, and later, his niece. The diplomats threatened to cut this allowance. They threatened to officially revoke his remaining privileges. They threatened to entirely excommunicate him from the very family that he still desperately, pathetically craved to be a part of. Yet these threats, designed to force a man of action into compliance, completely misjudged the broken psychology of Edward VIII. Confronted with the wrath of the British government, the Duke did not banish Donahue. Instead, he panicked. He was far more terrified of losing Wallace than he was of losing his allowance or his country's hollow respect. Wallace had made it violently clear that Donahue was her lifeline to youth, excitement, and relevance. If Edward forced Donahue out, Wallace would inevitably turn her suffocating boredom and resentment entirely onto him. For the Duke, the agonizing humiliation of sharing his wife with an openly gay, erratic billionaire was a price he was actively willing to pay to ensure she did not abandon him entirely. He chose the daily grinding torture of cuckoldry over the absolute terror of isolation. He equated this pathetic submission with the ultimate act of romantic sacrifice, entirely failing to realize that his wife did not view him as a martyr. She viewed him as a profoundly annoying obstacle. Donahue, possessing the sharp predatory instincts of a man who had spent his life buying people, sensed the Duke's paralyzing fear and weaponized it. As the pressure from the British establishment intensified, Donahue escalated his public displays of dominance, turning the psychological torture of the former king into a spectator sport for the transatlantic elite. He was no longer simply a generous guest paying for dinners. He became the absolute dictator of their existence. Donahue dictated their travel schedules, decided which parties they would attend, and openly mocked the Duke's outdated wardrobe and nervous habits in front of their wealthy peers. The power dynamic became so completely inverted that it crossed the line from scandalous to deeply uncomfortable for anyone forced to witness it. The visceral reality of their daily routine during the chaotic height of this 4-year affair played out as a masterclass in psychological subjugation and public degradation. The trio would occupy the most exclusive tables at El Morocco in New York or Maxim's in Paris. Donahue would arrive late, utterly unbothered, often wearing makeup or flamboyant gender-bending accessories that deliberately mocked the rigid masculine ideals of the era. He would sit beside Wallace, leaning in close, whispering inside jokes that excluded the Duke entirely. When the bill arrived, invariably totaling a sum that would take a working-class British family years to earn, Donahue would toss a stack of crisp bills onto the table with calculated disdain. The Duke of Windsor, a man whose face was once printed on the currency of an empire, would sit in silence, physically shrinking into his chair, offering a strained, apologetic smile to the waiters. There are chilling accounts from close associates detailing incidents where Donahue's cruelty became explicitly physical. In the claustrophobic confines of luxury vehicles or private yachts, Donahue was known to dismiss the Duke mid-sentence, loudly ordering him to fetch a drink or a misplaced item, speaking to him with the sharp, impatient tone one might use on an incompetent valet. And the Duke obeyed. He hurried to fulfill the request, desperate to keep the peace, desperate to avoid a tantrum from Donahue or a cold, punishing glare from Wallace. Wallace, for her part, did not merely tolerate this abuse, she actively participated in it. She laughed at Donahue's cruel jokes. She rolled her eyes when her husband attempted to assert any semblance of authority. She had spent years weaponizing her own coldness to control Edward, and now she was thrilled to have a billionaire accomplice to help her execute the punishment. She felt entirely justified. In her mind, Edward had ruined her life by forcing her into the suffocating role of a royal exile, and Donahue was her well-deserved compensation. This prolonged period of psychological subjugation completely eroded whatever fragments of dignity the Duke had managed to retain after 1936. The man who had confidently addressed millions on the radio, declaring his unyielding love, was now a neurotic, chain-smoking wreck who could barely make a decision without glancing nervously at his wife and her lover for approval. He suffered from severe bouts of insomnia and physical ailments driven entirely by acute anxiety. He was trapped in a prison of his own construction. He could not leave Wallace, because leaving her would mean admitting to the entire world that his historic abdication, the defining act of his existence, was a catastrophic, humiliating mistake. He was forced to stubbornly defend the illusion of his great romance while living inside a reality that was a grotesque, daily mockery of it. Jimmy Donahue, however, was fundamentally incapable of sustaining anything, even a game as thrilling as torturing a king. He was a creature of pure, destructive impulse, driven by deep-seated psychological demons and a rapidly escalating addiction to drugs and alcohol. The very traits that made him intoxicating to Wallace, his volatility, his lack of boundaries, his absolute disregard for consequences, were the exact traits that guaranteed the relationship would end in disaster. As the years dragged on, Donahue's behavior shifted from playfully outrageous to dangerously erratic. He became prone to violent mood swings, disappearing for days on end into the homosexual underworlds of major cities, only to return demanding immediate attention and absolute devotion from the royal couple. The glittering, dangerous excitement he had brought to the Windsors' lives began to sour, turning into a dark, exhausting liability. The triad was not a partnership. It was a hostage situation, and the captor was rapidly losing his mind. The breaking point was not a dramatic confrontation fueled by the Duke finally finding his courage. The breaking point was simply the inevitable exhaustion of a predator who had played with his food for too long. By the mid-1950s, Donahue looked at the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and saw nothing but two aging, incredibly needy people clinging to a fabricated past. He had proven his point. He had bought them, broken them, and paraded them before the world. There was no thrill left in humiliating a man who so easily accepted humiliation. The British establishment, with all its spies and diplomats, had failed to separate them, but Donahue's own terminal boredom accomplished what EMY5 could not. He began to withdraw his financial support, his presence, and his chaotic energy. The lavish gifts stopped arriving. The extravagant parties were abruptly canceled. He turned his attention toward younger, less complicated conquests, leaving the Windsors abruptly stranded in the wreckage of their own shredded reputations. The silence that followed Jimmy Donahue's abrupt departure from the Windsors' lives was not a peaceful one. It was the deafening, suffocating silence of a vacuum. For 4 years, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor had insulated themselves from the crushing reality of their irrelevance by surrounding themselves with the chaotic, manufactured noise of the Woolworth heirs' entourage. Donahue's money had purchased a relentless carousel of distractions: chartered yachts carving through the Mediterranean, private tables at the most exclusive nightclubs in Manhattan, and a constant swirling vortex of sycophants who were paid to laugh at their jokes and validate their existence. When that circus suddenly packed up and left town, the royal couple was violently thrown back into the stark, unforgiving reality of each other's company. The glittering armor of their fabricated social dominance was stripped away, exposing two aging, profoundly unhappy people staring at each other across the vast, empty expanse of their Parisian mansion. The predator had grown bored and released his prey, but the prey had entirely forgotten how to survive in the wild. For Wallace Simpson, the withdrawal of Jimmy Donahue was a devastating psychological blow that struck at the very core of her vanity and her carefully constructed self-worth. She was a woman who had staked her entire existence on her ability to captivate and control powerful men. She had conquered a king, bending the British Empire to its breaking point just to accommodate her ambition. But Donahue was the first man who had successfully conquered her, manipulated her, and ultimately discarded her when she no longer provided adequate amusement. He had offered her an intoxicating elixir of youth, danger, and unlimited financial freedom, masking the terrifying reality of her advancing age and her total social isolation. When he vanished, taking his chaotic energy and his checkbook with him, Wallace was forced to look into the mirror and confront the unvarnished truth. She was no longer the dangerous, alluring siren who had sparked a constitutional crisis. She was a woman rapidly approaching her 60s, universally despised by the British public, entirely alienated from the royal family she had sought to join, and permanently shackled to a man whose desperate, needy devotion she found physically and emotionally repulsive. The psychological whiplash of this abandonment triggered a profound dark shift in Wallace's behavior. Stripped of the daily, vibrant validation that Donahue had provided, she turned all her accumulated bitterness and frustration inward, weaponizing it against the only target available to her, her husband. The Duke of Windsor became the designated punching bag for all her deeply rooted resentments. If she could not punish the American billionaire who had humiliated her, she would ruthlessly punish the former King of England who had failed to protect her. Servants and close associates from this grim period recall the atmosphere in the Windsor household as intensely toxic, crackling with an unspoken, continuous hostility. Wallace no longer bothered to hide her disdain for Edward behind the polite, strained smiles she had previously utilized in public. Her criticisms became sharp, highly personal, and brutally relentless. She mocked his physical ailments, his outdated clothing, his lack of purpose, and most devastatingly, his total lack of masculine authority. She held him entirely responsible for the suffocating boredom of their exile, conveniently ignoring the fact that it was her own insatiable ambition that had engineered their tragic downfall. The Duke's reaction to this escalating emotional abuse was a study in pathetic, tragic conditioning. A man possessing even a fraction of normal self-esteem would have reached his breaking point, recognized the absolute failure of the marriage, and sought an escape. But Edward VIII was not a normal man. He was a psychological casualty of his own oppressive upbringing and his deeply entrenched pathological need for maternal domination. Throughout the Donahue affair, Edward had accepted his cuckolding and his public humiliation because it allowed him to remain in his wife's orbit. He had equated his suffering with a noble, romantic sacrifice. Now, with the rival removed, one might expect the Duke to reassert his position as the head of the household. Instead, he simply absorbed his wife's escalating cruelty with the eager, desperate submission of a whipped dog trying to win back its master's favor. Edward launched into a frantic, utterly humiliating campaign to replace the void left by Jimmy Donahue. He attempted to replicate the wild, extravagant gestures of the American playboy, organizing elaborate dinners and purchasing expensive jewelry, hoping to spark a flicker of the excitement Wallace had shown the billionaire. But these pathetic attempts only served to highlight his own fundamental inadequacy. He was trying to buy the affection of a woman who had already evaluated his worth and found it entirely lacking. When Wallace responded to his gifts with cold indifference or outright irritation, the Duke did not get angry. He simply apologized profusely and continuously for his failure to make her happy. He trailed after her through the cavernous rooms of their home, anticipating her needs, fetching her cigarettes, and nervously managing her constantly shifting moods. He had permanently abdicated his throne to marry her, and now he was permanently abdicating his basic human dignity just to survive in her presence. The cuckold had lost his rival, but the psychological dynamic of total degrading submission remained permanently hardwired into his brain. This tragic domestic reality was significantly compounded by a sudden, terrifying realization regarding their financial stability. For 4 years, the Windsors had lived a lifestyle of staggering, unhinged opulence, entirely insulated from the actual cost of their decadence because Jimmy Donahue had quietly picked up the tab. They had flown across the Atlantic in private chartered massive luxury vessels, and hosted hundreds of guests at the finest restaurants in the world without ever glancing at a bill. When Donahue severed his ties, the financial hangover hit the royal couple with the force of a physical blow. The Duke of Windsor possessed a substantial personal fortune, accumulated during his years as Prince of Wales, and augmented by private family settlements. But it was not the bottomless, infinite well of the Woolworth Empire. Left to fund their own reckless extravagance, the Windsors quickly realized they were hemorrhaging money at a deeply alarming rate. The illusion of their unlimited power, so carefully maintained during the Donahue years, began to crumble under the mundane, humiliating pressure of unpaid invoices and demanding creditors. This sudden financial vulnerability forced the Duke into the one position he hated more than any other. He had to return to his family and beg for money. The communications sent from Paris to London during this period were stripped of all the defiant, haughty entitlement that had characterized the Duke's early years of exile. He was forced to write deeply humiliating letters to his brother, and later to his niece, Queen Elizabeth II, pleading for increases to his unofficial allowance, citing the rising costs of maintaining an appropriate royal standard of living in a modern world. The British establishment, fully aware of the millions Donahue had previously spent on the couple, viewed these requests with a mixture of cold satisfaction and absolute contempt. The intelligence services had meticulously tracked the sudden end of the bisexual triad, confirming that the American threat had neutralized itself. For the men in Whitehall, the Duke's desperate pleas for cash were the ultimate proof of his total degradation. The Queen Mother, who operated as the fierce, unforgiving emotional center of the British royal family, observed the Windsors decline from London with a rigid, icy sense of vindication. She had never forgiven Edward for the abdication, holding him personally responsible for thrusting the agonizing burden of the crown onto her shy, unprepared husband, ultimately working him into an early grave. She had always viewed Wallis Simpson not as a romantic heroine, but as a dangerous, cheap adventuress who had seduced a weak-minded prince. The intelligence reports detailing the Donahue affair, the public cuckolding, and the subsequent financial panic only confirmed every dark suspicion she had ever harbored. The establishment did not celebrate the end of the Donahue affair. They simply tightened the quarantine around the Duke and Duchess. They had survived the immediate public relations threat, but the permanent stain on the Duke's character was firmly established. There would be no reconciliation, no meaningful return to public life, no redemption. The Windsors were to be left in Paris to slowly suffocate in their own toxic, expensive irrelevance. As the 1950s bled into the 1960s, the physical toll of this relentless grinding misery began to manifest itself on the couple's bodies, breaking down the glamorous facade they had so desperately tried to maintain. The world outside their gilded cage was changing rapidly. The post-war austerity was giving way to the atomic age, the space race, and sweeping radical cultural shifts. The global public, once captivated by the scandal of the abdication, had entirely moved on, viewing the Duke and Duchess as bizarre, archaic relics of a dead era. The Duke, ravaged by decades of acute anxiety, heavy drinking, and chain smoking, began to rapidly deteriorate. The boyish, golden charm that had once made him the most photographed man on earth vanished entirely, replaced by a hollowed-out, deeply lined face that permanently wore an expression of nervous, tragic apology. He suffered from severe eye issues, circulatory problems, and a terrifying, pervasive frailty that made him look a decade older than his actual age. He was a man slowly collapsing in on himself, entirely consumed by the monumental mistake of his own life. Wallace, fiercely determined to fight the ravages of age and her own deep-seated unhappiness, embarked on a rigid, punishing regimen of severe dieting and continuous cosmetic interventions. She maintained a terrifyingly skeletal figure, draping her sharp, angular frame in the most expensive avant-garde Parisian couture, effectively using fashion as a heavy armor to deflect the world's pity. But the tight, perfectly lifted skin of her face could not hide the cold, dead emptiness in her eyes. The vibrant, dangerous spark that had captivated a king and temporarily amused a billionaire was completely extinguished. She looked exactly like what she was, a profoundly bitter woman trapped in a loveless, transactional marriage, presiding over a court of ghosts. They continued to attend the right parties, pose for the right photographers, and maintain the exhausting daily performance of the greatest love story of the century. But the performance had become a grim, mechanical death march. The audience had left the theater. The lights had been cut, but the actors simply did not know how to stop reciting the lines. The true, horrifying tragedy of the Windsor exile was not that they lost an empire, it was that they entirely lost themselves. They had traded the immense, world-shaping responsibility of the British monarchy for a life of absolute, unadulterated selfishness, believing that their love would be enough to sustain them. But love, when built on a foundation of narcissism, betrayal, and a desperate need for validation, is a highly unstable element. Jimmy Donahue was not the cause of their destruction. He was simply the violent catalyst that exposed the deep structural rot that was already there. He held up a mirror to the royal couple, forcing them to look at the ugly, pathetic reality of their dynamic. And then he walked away, leaving them alone in the day, arcade with the reflection. The former King of England, the man who had possessed the ultimate power, had willingly engineered his own permanent, inescapable prison, and he had handed the keys to a woman who fundamentally despised him. As the 1950s bled into the turbulent, hyperkinetic landscape of the 1960s, the exclusive, highly curated world that the Duke and Duchess of Windsor had so desperately tried to conquer simply ceased to exist. The global aristocracy, the cafe society of interwar Europe, and the rigid, unspoken social hierarchies that had once given their royal rebellion its scandalous weight were being rapidly and entirely swept away. The world's attention had violently shifted. The public was now captivated by the terrifying brinkmanship of the Cold War, the assassination of political icons, the explosive rise of youth culture, and the deafening roar of the space race. In this fiercely modernizing, cynical new era, Edward and Wallace were no longer dangerous, glamorous exiles threatening the stability of a nation. They were dusty, embarrassing anachronisms, living waxworks trapped inside a museum of their own making that nobody wanted to visit anymore. The absolute tragedy of their existence was that they had sacrificed a global empire to secure a place in high society, only to watch that society evaporate around them, leaving them entirely stranded on the shores of irrelevance. This profound cultural obsolescence was brutally mirrored by the rapid, agonizing physical deterioration of the Duke himself. The body that Edward had punished for decades with severe, unmanaged anxiety, a diet masquerading as aristocratic leanness, and a relentless chain-smoking habit began to aggressively and humiliatingly fail him. The golden, charismatic Prince of Wales, who had once sprinted up the gangways of battleships and charmed millions with a devastatingly handsome smile, vanished forever. In his place stood a frail, severely stooped, and tragically diminished old man. He suffered from agonizing abdominal aneurysms, severe retinal detachments that required terrifying surgical interventions, and left him partially blind, and the creeping, undeniable onset of throat cancer. The sheer physical agony of his daily existence became a stark, cruel reflection of his internal psychological ruin. Whenever his medical crises necessitated major surgeries, he was often admitted to clinics in London or Houston, Texas, creating profoundly awkward, intensely managed diplomatic headaches for the British crown. The royal family's response to the Duke's escalating physical agony was a masterclass in glacial, institutional cruelty. Queen Elizabeth II, guided by the unforgiving hand of the Queen Mother and the strict paranoid protocols of the British intelligence apparatus, offered only the absolute bare minimum of public sympathy required to avoid a catastrophic public relations scandal. There were no warm, tearful family reunions beside his hospital bed, no grand gestures of a historical forgiveness, and no easing of the brutal exile that had defined his life since 1936. The occasional highly publicized visits from minor royals or the Queen herself were brief, painfully formal, and heavily monitored by palace aides. The underlying message delivered by the establishment was unmistakable and completely devoid of empathy. You may be dying, and you may be family, but you are still the man who abandoned his sacred duty. The British monarchy was perfectly, ruthlessly content to let the former king bleed out slowly in the gilded, lonely cage he had built for himself, ensuring that his legacy remained permanently tainted by failure and submission. For Wallace Simpson, the Duke's physical collapse was not a source of profound, empathetic sorrow. It was an infuriating, terrifying inconvenience. His frailty directly threatened the last remaining shreds of the glamorous, powerful facade she was fighting a desperate, losing battle to maintain. As Edward grew weak, Wallace grew increasingly, terrifyingly manic. Stripped of the chaotic energy of Jimmy Donahue and the adulation of a society that had moved on, she instituted a regime of absolute tyrannical control over their sprawling mansion in the Bois de Boulogne. She obsessed with a feverish intensity over the exact placement of every silver spoon, the perfection of every floral arrangement, and the precise temperature of the dining room, utilizing relentless micromanagement as a desperate psychological shield against the creeping, undeniable chaos of mortality. She subjected herself to punishing starvation-level diets to maintain a skeletal, severely angular figure, draping her emaciated frame in the most expensive avant-garde Givenchy and Dior couture money could buy. She no longer looked like a living, breathing woman. She looked like an exquisite, terrifyingly sharp weapon forged from pure, concentrated bitterness. The ultimate, inescapable tragedy of their daily existence lay in the absolute necessity of maintaining their myth. They were the architects, the chief propagandists, and ultimately the sole prisoners of the greatest love story of the century. They could not divorce, they could not permanently separate, and they could not even afford to publicly disagree. To do so would be to admit to the entire watching world, and more importantly, to the unforgiving royal family across the channel, that the abdication, the singular world-shattering earthquake of their lives, had been a catastrophic, humiliating mistake. They were chained to the corpse of their own grand romance, and so they were forced to endlessly perform. They sat for stiff, excruciatingly awkward television interviews with prominent journalists where they appeared like heavily medicated ghosts reciting long rehearsed lines. On cue, they gazed into each other's eyes, forced tight, unnatural smiles, and spoke vaguely of their great sacrifice and their perfect understanding, while the heavy air between them crackled with unspoken resentment, profound exhaustion, and the silent scream of two people drowning in each other's company. Their legendary dinner parties, once the highly coveted epicenter of elite Parisian and transatlantic society, gradually mutated into grotesque echoing affairs. The sycophants, the powerful billionaires, the social climbers, and the predatory playboys like Donahue had long since abandoned the Windsors, moving on to younger, more vibrant, and more politically relevant prey. The Duke and Duchess were increasingly left dining alone at a massive mahogany table set for 20, attended only by a small army of nervous, well-paid servants who watched the silent, agonizing spectacle unfold night after night. The Duke would sit at one end, a fragile, trembling shadow of a man, nursing a watered-down scotch, his failing eyes staring blankly at the woman for whom he had surrendered a global empire. Wallace would sit at the exact opposite end, her jaw tightly clenched, her eyes cold, flat, and empty, staring back at the ghost of a king who had completely failed to give her the world she felt she deserved. This was the ultimate, devastating consequence of a love built entirely on the fragile foundations of narcissism, ego, and the violent destruction of duty. They had successfully defied the British Empire. They had survived the brutal intervention of MI5, and they had weathered the humiliating, depraved storm of the Donahue affair. But they could not survive the quiet, suffocating terror of their own irrelevance. They had won the ultimate prize, each other, but in the process, they had lost absolutely everything else that gave a human life meaning, structure, and dignity. They were two rotting pillars, supporting a grand, hollow monument to their own vanity, sitting in the absolute silence of their Parisian mansion, simply waiting for the inevitable quiet collapse of the roof above them, the creeping, undeniable shadow of mortality finally descending dead upon the sprawling mansion in the Bois de Boulogne as the calendar turned to the early 1970s. The Duke of Windsor, who had spent the better part of 3 decades aggressively punishing his own body to cope with the severe, unmanageable anxiety of his exile, was now paying the absolute and final price. The diagnosis of inoperable throat cancer was not delivered with the grand, somber pageantry that typically accompanies the failing health of a sovereign. It was delivered with the cold, sterile efficiency of foreign oncologists to a man who had long ago ceased to matter to the geopolitical machinations of the world. Edward's physical deterioration accelerated with a terrifying, humiliating velocity. He wasted away to a skeletal figure, his weight dropping precariously below 100 pounds. The vocal cords that had once broadcast his historic abdication speech to millions of breathless listeners across the British Empire were now ravaged by tumors, reducing his voice to a strained, agonizing rasp. He was confined to his private quarters, tethered to oxygen tanks and heavily medicated, completely stripped of the meticulously tailored aristocratic armor he had used to project an illusion of dignity for so many years. The man who had once commanded the largest naval fleet on earth was now entirely helpless, utterly dependent on a rotating staff of private nurses to manage his relentless physical agony. For Wallis Simpson, the terrifying reality of her husband's impending death did not trigger a wellspring of profound empathetic grief. Rather, it triggered a state of sheer, absolute panic. Edward was not just her husband. He was the sole, indispensable pillar upon which her entire, carefully constructed identity rested. Without the Duke of Windsor, she was no longer the Duchess of Windsor. She would be instantly reduced to the status of an elderly, universally despised widow, an isolated American expatriate living alone in a massive, echoing house. Consequently, Wallis responded to Edward's terminal decline with a fierce, almost manic state of denial. She refused to alter the rigid, formal routines of the household. She continued to obsessively dictate the daily menus, the floral arrangements, and the rigorous cleaning schedules, utilizing these mundane administrative details as a psychological barricade against the terrifying chaos of death. She rarely visited his sick room, finding the sight of his emaciated, dying body intensely repulsive and a deeply offensive reminder of her own advancing age. She preferred to sit in the immaculate drawing rooms downstairs, heavily armored in exquisite couture and flawlessly applied cosmetics, waiting for a society that had long since forgotten her to suddenly come calling. She was furious at Edward for dying, viewing his biological failure as the ultimate unforgivable abandonment. The profound cognitive dissonance of the Windsor marriage reached its horrifying zenith in these final months. Despite the decades of emotional abuse, the public humiliations, the catastrophic financial panic, and the dark, degrading shadow of the Jimmy Donahue affair, Edward's pathological devotion to Wallis remained terrifyingly intact. As he lay dying in a drug-induced haze, he continually asked for her, his rasping voice affectionately referring to her as his perfect woman. He still believed, with the desperate, delusional fervor of a cult member, that his abdication had been a noble sacrifice for the greatest romance in human history. He simply could not allow himself to acknowledge the truth, because to admit that his marriage was a hollow, transactional failure would be to admit that his entire life and the loss of his empire had been a meaningless, pathetic mistake. He chose to die inside the myth he had created. He spent his final weeks staring at photographs of Wallis from the 1930s, clinging to the frozen two-dimensional image of the woman who had conquered him, entirely ignoring the cold, reality of the woman who now refused to sit by his bedside. The ultimate devastating humiliation of Edward's life was orchestrated, not by Wallis, but by the relentless, unforgiving machinery of the British Crown. In May of 1972, Queen Elizabeth II, accompanied by Prince Philip and Prince Charles, embarked on a highly publicized state visit to France. The optics of the situation presented a profound diplomatic dilemma for the royal family. It was universally known that the Queen's uncle was weeks, perhaps days, away from death. For the reigning monarch to visit Paris and blatantly ignore the dying former king would be perceived as a shocking display of callousness, generating entirely unnecessary public sympathy for a man the establishment still viewed as a traitor to his duty. Consequently, a visit was arranged. It was not a visit born of familial love, forgiveness, or reconciliation. It was an act of brutal, calculated, historical housekeeping. The crown needed to be seen paying its final respects, officially closing the book on the abdication crisis with a display of impeccable, icy propriety. The scene that unfolded in the Duke's private quarters on the afternoon of the Queen's visit was a masterclass in the terrible destructive power of royal protocol. Edward, driven by a final desperate surge of ingrained sovereign pride, absolutely refused to be seen receiving the reigning monarch in his bed. Despite suffering from severe pain and profound weakness, he forced his medical staff to disconnect his intravenous tubes. It took a grueling, agonizing effort to dress his emaciated body in a formal blazer, a crisp shirt, and a neatly tied cravat. He insisted on sitting upright in a leather armchair to await his niece. When Queen Elizabeth II entered the room, the contrast was violently jarring. She stood before him as the absolute embodiment of global power, institutional stability, and unwavering duty. Everything he had deliberately thrown away. The conversation between them was perfectly polite, terribly brief, and completely devoid of any genuine human warmth. They spoke of the weather, of the gardens, of mundane trivialities, whilst the massive, unspoken weight of history and betrayal hung suffocatingly in the air. The British establishment had secured its final permanent victory. They had arrived to find the great rebel thoroughly broken, physically ruined, and desperately trying to maintain appearances for the very institution he had once defied. Wallis was systematically and deliberately marginalized during this historic encounter. She was permitted to greet the Queen at the entrance and to serve tea in the drawing room, but the private meeting in the Duke's bedroom was strictly reserved for the blood royale. Wallis seethed with a quiet, lethal resentment. She stood in her own home, dressed in immaculate Givenchy, and watched as the young woman who possessed the title she had so desperately craved, Her Majesty the Queen, commanded the entire space with effortless, devastating authority. Wallis realized in that moment that all her manicured elegance, all the millions spent by Jimmy Donahue to create the illusion of their supremacy, meant absolutely nothing in the face of genuine institutional power. The royal family had entered her territory, marginalized her existence, and staked a final claim on the dying king. 10 days later, on May 28, 1972, the Duke of Windsor died. The immediate aftermath of his passing was characterized not by a profound outpouring of global grief, but by the swift, incredibly efficient mobilization of the British state apparatus. The man who had been strictly exiled for 35 years was suddenly, aggressively reclaimed by the crown in death. The Royal Air Force immediately dispatched an aircraft to Paris to collect his body. His remains were placed in a coffin and flown back to the country that had expelled him, to be buried in the royal burial ground at Frogmore. The narrative was instantly seized and controlled by the establishment. The British press published respectful, carefully sanitized obituaries that focused heavily on his brief service in World War I and his charming youth as the Prince of Wales, entirely erasing the dark, humiliating decades of his exile, the fascist sympathies, and the depraved reality of the bisexual triad. In death, Edward VIII was finally rehabilitated, scrubbed clean, and successfully filed away into the safe, manageable archives of royal history. For Wallis, the funeral in England was a journey into absolute terrifying isolation. She was officially invited by the Queen, heavily sedated, and flown to London, where she was housed in Buckingham Palace, but she was treated not as a grieving family member, but as a highly radioactive, deeply inconvenient ghost. The Queen Mother, the architect of her lifelong exile, finally had her moment of absolute triumphant vindication. Wallis stood at the graveside heavily veiled, a frail, deeply unpopular figure, surrounded by the impenetrable ranks of the British aristocracy who despised her. As the coffin of the man who had surrendered the world for her was lowered into the earth, the crushing reality of her future solidified. The royal family had taken Edward back, effectively erasing her narrative and her importance. She was returning to Paris entirely alone. There was no king to control, no billionaire playboy to fund her vanity, and no audience left to watch her perform. The grand, chaotic, destructive theater of her life had permanently closed, leaving her with nothing but the terrifying prospect of outliving her own myth in a massive, silent house filled only with the ghosts of her own catastrophic choices. The return to the sprawling, impeccably manicured estate in the Bois de Boulogne was the true beginning of Wallis Simpson's final agonizing punishment. When the heavy iron gates swung shut behind her black limousine in June of 1972, they did not just seal her off from the prying lenses of the Parisian paparazzi, they sealed her inside a suffocating mausoleum of her own catastrophic ambition. For 35 years, the massive, opulent rooms of this house had served as the grand, theatrical stage upon which the Duke and Duchess of Windsor performed their daily desperate justification to the world. Every silver candelabra, every piece of Meissen porcelain, every priceless pug dog that trotted across the Aubusson carpets had been a prop in the relentless production of the greatest love story of the century. But now the leading man was dead, permanently reclaimed by the cold, unforgiving soil of the British royal family. The audience had long since departed. The terrifying absolute silence of the mansion descended upon Wallis with the crushing physical weight of an ocean, forcing her to finally confront the unvarnished, horrifying reality of her existence. Stripped of the Duke of Windsor, Wallis was instantly stripped of her entire fabricated identity. She was a woman who had spent her entire life ruthlessly calculating her own worth through the reflection of the powerful, wealthy men she managed to conquer and control. She had orchestrated the downfall of a global empire to secure the absolute devotion of a king, and when that devotion became a suffocating, pathetic bore, she had enthusiastically allowed the openly gay, chaotic billionaire Jimmy Donahue to purchase her amusement and humiliate her husband. Her life had been a series of high-stakes transactional conquests. But in the stark, echoing aftermath of Edward's funeral, there were no more conquests to be had. She was a frail, deeply unpopular 76-year-old widow, globally despised for her perceived role in destroying a monarch, and entirely devoid of any genuine, unconditional human connection. The men who had defined her narrative were gone. Donahue had destroyed himself in a haze of drugs and alcohol years prior, dying a lonely, pathetic death that mirrored the oral bankruptcy of his wealth. Edward was buried in Frogmore, effectively absorbed back into the institution he had betrayed. Wallis was left with nothing but the vast, terrifying emptiness of her own ego. This psychological vacuum inevitably attracted a new, far more insidious type of predator, Throughout the 1950s, Jimmy Donahue had utilized his immense Woolworth fortune to aggressively buy his way into the Windsors' bed and control their social calendar, operating with the flamboyant, destructive energy of a spoiled child breaking his favorite toys. But the predator who stepped into the void left by the Duke's death operated with the cold, lethal precision of a legal executioner. Enter Maître Suzanne Blum, a formidable, deeply draconian French lawyer who had briefly represented the Windsors in the past. Sensing the absolute vulnerability of an isolated, aging woman sitting on top of a mountain of priceless historical artifacts and royal jewels, Blum systematically engineered a total uncompromising takeover of Wallis Simpson's life. Wallis, who had spent decades terrifying her staff and manipulating a king with a single, icy glare, was entirely outmatched by the bureaucratic ruthlessness of the French attorney. The tragic irony of this shifting power dynamic was absolute. Wallis Simpson had fought a vicious, lifelong war against the British establishment to maintain her independence and secure her supreme status, only to willingly surrender her autonomy to a ruthless employee in her twilight years. Blum quickly dismissed the Duchess's long-standing loyal friends, barring them from entering the estate under the guise of protecting Wallis's fragile health. Telephone calls were intercepted. Mail was heavily monitored and destroyed. The grand, echoing mansion was transformed into a high-security prison, and Wallis was its sole high-value inmate. Blum took total control of the Windsor finances, the estate, and most chillingly, the rights to the Duke and Duchess's loo, creative intellectual property, and private correspondence. The woman who had once reveled in the dangerous bisexual triad, manipulating two of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the world with a flick of her wrist, was now entirely dominated by a lawyer who viewed her not as a human being, but as a highly profitable, decaying asset. As the 1970s dragged into the 1980s, the physical and neurological collapse of the Duchess of Windsor mirrored the total dismantling of her agency. The punishing starvation-level diets and the relentless, exhausting stress of maintaining her ironclad public facade finally broke her body. She was struck by crippling, agonizing bouts of rheumatoid arthritis that twisted her hands, the same hands that had once eagerly accepted millions of dollars in diamonds from Jimmy Donahue, into gnarled, useless claws. More devastatingly, the sharp, cynical, and ruthlessly calculating mind that had successfully navigated the most treacherous political and social waters of the 20th century began to unravel. The creeping, relentless fog of dementia descended upon her, fracturing her memory and entirely unmooring her from reality. The horror of Wallis's final years cannot be overstated. It was a punishment uniquely tailored to a woman whose entire existence was predicated on the absolute control of her image and her environment. She was confined entirely to her bedroom, a prisoner in a bed, surrounded by the fading, mocking photographs of her former glory. She lost the ability to speak, to walk, and ultimately to feed herself. She, who had once spent hours obsessively coordinating the exact shade of her Givenchy gowns, with the floral centerpieces for dinners, with heads of state, was now routinely turned, cleaned, and managed by a rotating staff of indifferent nurses operating under the strict, unsympathetic orders of Suzanne Blum. She was kept alive by a battery of medical machinery, her emaciated body enduring a forced, mechanical continuation of LeFou, long after her spirit had been entirely extinguished. In her fractured, deteriorating mind, the boundaries of time collapsed, allowing the ghosts of her past to terrorize her present. The agonizing isolation of her bedroom became the final, inescapable courtroom where the catastrophic choices of her life were laid bare. Did the memories of Jimmy Donahue's chaotic, drug-fueled parties provide any comfort in the suffocating silence of her paralysis? Or did they merely serve as a brutal reminder of the cheap, fleeting, and deeply degrading nature of the thrills she had chosen over dignity? She had allowed an American playboy to publicly cuckold a king just to cure her own boredom. She had watched, laughing, as the man who had laid the British Empire at her feet was reduced to fetching drinks and enduring the sneers of a flamboyant heir. In the brutal, unforgiving clarity of her final isolation, the greatest love story was finally exposed not as a tragedy of forbidden romance, but as a grotesque monument to her own profound selfishness and his pathetic, enabling weakness. Meanwhile, outside the walls of her bedroom, the meticulous dismantling of her legacy was already underway. Suzanne Blum, operating with absolute impunity, began to quietly catalog and control the staggering wealth accumulated during the Windsor exile. The magnificent jewels, some purchased with the deeply resentful allowance provided by the British Crown, others gifted by Donahue during his frantic transactional courtship, were locked away in vaults waiting to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. The physical evidence of their grand, tragic existence was being reduced to mere inventory. The British establishment, watching this grim finale unfold from across the English Channel, maintained a posture of icy, absolute silence. They had successfully reclaimed their fallen king, buried him on their terms, and effectively erased the deeply humiliating reality of his submission. They had no interest, hatsoever, in the decaying, paralyzed woman left behind in Paris. They simply waited for her to die, confident that the unforgiving machinery of time and the aggressive, sanitized history they were writing would permanently bury the true depraved reality of the Windsor exile. The tragic contradiction of Wallis Simpson's life remains a glaring, open wound in the fabric of modern history. She was a woman who possessed no royal blood, no significant wealth, and no conventional beauty, yet she utilized sheer, unadulterated ambition to fundamentally alter the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century. She demanded absolute power, total freedom, and unyielding devotion, completely indifferent to the devastating collateral damage her desires inflicted upon a nation, a family, and ultimately a king. Yet the universe has a brutal, poetic method of correcting such extreme, unchecked vanity. The woman who sought to control the world ended her life entirely unable to control her own body, locked away in a silent room, completely forgotten by the society she had sacrificed everything to dominate, and entirely at the mercy of strangers who eagerly awaited her final breath so they could sell off the glittering wreckage of her life. The final, agonizing chapter of Wallis Simpson's existence did not conclude with a dramatic crescendo or a moment of profound deathbed revelation. It ended with a slow, suffocating fade into absolute obscurity, a grim and silent extinguishment of a life that had once violently demanded the attention of the entire globe. By the time the spring of 1986 arrived, the sprawling, fiercely guarded mansion in the Bois de Boulogne had been entirely stripped of its former terrifying vitality. The woman lying paralyzed in the heavily shadowed master bedroom, sustained entirely by a complex humming network of medical machinery, bore absolutely no resemblance to the razor-sharp, endlessly ambitious socialite who had once brought the British Empire to the brink of constitutional collapse. She was 89 years old, a frail skeletal prisoner locked deep within the impenetrable fortress of her own shattered mind. She had spent the last 14 years of her life in a state of profound enforced isolation, entirely at the mercy of Suzanne Blum, the draconian French lawyer who had ruthlessly usurped control of her estate, her finances, and her legacy. The vibrant, dangerous woman who had eagerly engaged in the depraved bisexual triad with Jimmy Donahue, laughing as an American billionaire, publicly humiliated her royal husband, had been reduced to a silent, unmoving asset, waiting patiently to be liquidated. When Wallis Simpson finally drew her last breath on April 24th, 1986, the news did not shatter the world. It merely elicited a collective heavy sigh of relief from across the English Channel. For the British royal family, her death represented the final, highly anticipated conclusion to a grueling 50-year nightmare of public relations and institutional paranoia. Buckingham Palace, guided by the still formidable, deeply unforgiving hand of the Queen Mother, responded to the passing of the Duchess of Windsor with a masterclass in icy, calculated protocol. There were no grand declarations of national mourning, no flags lowered to half-mast across the Commonwealth, and absolutely no public expressions of genuine familial sorrow. Instead, the formidable machinery of the British state mobilized with a swift, sterile efficiency designed to permanently bury the architect of their greatest modern crisis. The establishment, which had spent decades deploying MI5 agents to actively suppress the grotesque reality of the Windsors' decadent exile, now moved to quietly sweep the remaining debris under the heavy rug of official history. The logistics of her final return to the United Kingdom were executed with a stark, punishing minimalism that stood in violent contrast to the staggering, unhinged opulence she had relentlessly pursued in life. Wallis Simpson had fought a bitter, lifelong war to force the British establishment to recognize her as Her Royal Highness, demanding the respect, the curtsies, and the absolute deference she felt her conquest of the king entitled her to. The establishment had universally and fiercely denied her that title, and now in death they offered her only the coldest, most rigid form of institutional charity. Her unadorned oak coffin was flown into a Royal Air Force base, devoid of the grand military pageantry that typically accompanied the transport of royal remains. She was transported to Windsor Castle not as a beloved family member finally coming home, but as a highly controversial, politically radioactive artifact being quietly filed away into the permanent archives. The funeral service held at St. George's Chapel was a brief, excruciatingly awkward affair, deliberately stripped of any warmth or personal tribute. There was no eulogy delivered to celebrate her life, no choir singing hymns of grand redemption, and no public crowds weeping outside the ancient stone walls. The congregation was remarkably sparse, populated primarily by the senior members of the royal family, who attended out of a strict, unyielding sense of duty rather than grief. Queen Elizabeth II stood stoically, her expression an impenetrable mask of sovereign endurance, but it was the presence of the Queen Mother that cast the heaviest, most triumphant shadow over the proceedings. She stood near the altar, a formidable matriarch in black, looking down at the wooden box containing the remains of the woman she had privately referred to as the lowest of the low. For half a century, the Queen Mother had held Wallis Simpson personally responsible for the premature death of King George VI, blaming the heavy, crushing stress of the abdication for destroying her husband. As the short, sterile service concluded, the Queen Mother secured her final absolute victory. The great American advent. Therese, the woman who had seduced a king and allowed a gay billionaire to fund her decadent vanity, was finally permanently silenced, entirely surrounded by the very people who had successfully engineered her lifelong destruction. Following the service, the coffin was transported to the royal burial ground at Frogmore to be interred beside the Duke of Windsor under a simple shared marker. It was the ultimate inescapable irony of her existence. Wallace had spent decades feeling violently trapped by Edward's suffocating, needy devotion, eagerly seeking the chaotic, dangerous distractions of men like Jimmy Donahue to escape the sheer boredom of her marriage. Yet in the end, she was eternally bound to the very man she had so deeply resented. The royal family had reclaimed their fallen sovereign and his deeply problematic wife, burying them side by side in the quiet, manicured earth of Windsor, effectively sealing the tomb on the greatest love story of the century and ensuring that the dark, humiliating truth of their exile remained safely locked beneath the soil. However, while the British establishment successfully buried the physical bodies of the Windsors, they could not prevent the grotesque, highly commercialized plundering of their legacy. In the immediate aftermath of Wallace's death, Maitre Suzanne Bloom, operating with the ruthless, unchecked authority she had consolidated during the Duchess's final paralyzed years, moved to systematically liquidate the staggering material wealth of the Windsor estate. The magnificent mansion in the Bois de Boulogne, the site of so much manufactured glamour and deep, unspoken misery, was quickly leased to Mohammed Al-Fayed, the controversial Egyptian billionaire. In a twist of profound historical poetry, Al-Fayed was another wildly wealthy outsider desperately attempting to purchase his way into the fiercely guarded upper echelons of the British establishment, utilizing the lingering tragic aura of the Windsors to validate his own relentless social climbing. But it was the spectacular auction of the Duchess of Windsor's legendary jewelry collection in April 1987 that served as the final devastating post-mortem of their entire hollow existence. Held by Sotheby's in Geneva, the auction was a frenzied, glittering circus of global wealth, attracting billionaires, Hollywood celebrities, and obsessive royal collectors from every corner of the earth. The items placed on the auction block were not merely precious stones and metals. They were the heavily contested physical artifacts of a deeply corrupt and fundamentally broken romance. There were the magnificent custom-designed Cartier Panther bracelets, the exquisite flamingo brooches, and the massive, flawless diamonds that the Duke had purchased to compensate for his absolute lack of purpose and masculine authority. And hidden within that staggering hoard were the unspoken, undocumented pieces, the lavish gifts funded by the seemingly infinite Woolworth fortune of Jimmy Donahue, the glittering bribes paid to secure his place within their twisted, bisexual triad. As the auctioneer's hammer fell again and again, generating tens of millions of dollars, the grand mythical facade of the Windsor romance was brutally, commercially dismantled. The buyers were not purchasing symbols of a great tragic sacrifice. They were buying the physical evidence of a love that had entirely failed to sustain itself without the relentless injection of third-party wealth and chaotic validation. In the decades that followed, the gradual declassification of MI5 dossiers and government files dragged this grotesque reality into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. The The world was forced to confront the terrifying truth. The man who had briefly held the title of King Emperor had willingly reduced himself to a submissive lapdog, controlled by an erratic playboy. Wallis Simpson was similarly stripped of her romantic victimhood, definitively exposed not as a woma, swept away by uncontrollable passion, but as a calculating opportunist trapped in a suffocating gilded cage of her own design. The story of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor remains one of the most chilling cautionary tales of the modern era, a brutal testament to the corrosive power of unchecked privilege and the devastating consequences of elevating personal vanity above monumental duty. The fallen king, definitively unmasked by the unsealed archives as a moral coward who actively fraternized with the enemies of humanity, now rests eternally under the protective, hallowed earth of the empire he abandoned. It is the ultimate chilling irony of his existence. A majestic sovereign who aggressively engineered his own ruin and gleefully reduced himself to a subservient plaything, only to be seamlessly reclaimed by the very institution he betrayed, his tragic, humiliating submission permanently locked beneath the immaculate lawns of Frogmore.